I have been the parish minister of St. Mary's, Holloway, in the small North London suburb of the same name, for 31 years. I have, by the small private courtesy of the parish vestry, also been the chair of the Board of Governors of the small St. Mary's Parish Primary School on the same green for the same 31 years. In that time we have engaged in the small careful school's music post, perhaps 8 successive young music mistresses. None of them has done to my old neighbour Mr. Theodore Burnham, the small careful organist of the parish for 42 years, the husband of the late concert-pianist Mrs. Caroline Burnham, who died in the spring of the year before, what Miss Beatrice Holland of the small careful village of Lavering, Suffolk, did to him at the small careful autumn concert of the second Tuesday in November, when she sat at the small careful upright in the corner of the school hall, and played the second intermezzo of the Brahms, Opus 118 from memory. I am the Reverend Cuthbert Allerby. I am 67. The small careful upright was the small careful school's old Broadwood upright, given to St. Mary's Parish Primary in 1894 by a small careful Holloway widow on the occasion of her grandson's confirmation. Mr. Theodore Burnham was 68. His late wife, Mrs. Caroline Burnham, born Caroline Whitmore of the small careful village of Lavering in Suffolk in the year 1843, taken to London in her 10th year by her teacher, the late Sir Anthony Castellan of the Royal Academy, married to Mr. Theodore Burnham of Holloway in her 24th year, had given her last solo recital at the Wigmore in the spring of her 65th year. She had retired from the concert circuit afterwards. She had spent the small careful last 7 years of her life in the small careful village of Lavering, Suffolk, where she had been born, in the small careful cottage of her late mother. She had taken in those small careful 7 years exactly one private pupil, a small careful village girl of the parish, whom the small careful village vicar had recommended to her. She had not, by her own small careful private decision, ever told her husband Mr. Burnham who the small careful girl was. He had known only that she existed, and that she had been the late Mrs. Burnham's only pupil in her small careful Lavering years. Mrs. Burnham had died in the spring of the year before. Mr. Burnham had been, in the 18 months since, the small careful widower of the parish, quiet, dignified, deeply private in his grief. He had kept up his small careful organ post at St. Mary's. He had not, in the 18 months since, attended the small careful Tuesday autumn concert at St. Mary's Parish Primary School, as he had attended it in his wife's lifetime every year for 32 consecutive years. Miss Beatrice Holland had come to St. Mary's Parish Primary in the small careful autumn term as the school's newly engaged music mistress. She was 24. She had taken her teaching diploma at the small careful regional college at Ipswich 2 summers before. She had grown up in the small careful village of Lavering, Suffolk, the small village which had been, by the small careful private circumstance of her birth, also the small village of the late Mrs. Caroline Burnham's retirement. She had been, between her 15th and her 22nd year, the small careful private pupil of the late Mrs. Caroline Burnham at the small careful upright of her cottage, in the small careful village of Lavering, Suffolk. She had not, in her small careful interview with the school's head mistress in the small careful summer, mentioned this small careful private circumstance. She had not, in her small careful first 2 months in the small careful school music post, mentioned it to any small careful colleague or parent of the school. She had taken her small careful post in the small careful village manner she had been taught by her mother, quiet, useful, the small careful background music of the school's small careful day. The small careful PTA of St. Mary's Parish Primary School had not, in its small careful private chair, taken to her. Mrs. Hester Lambourn, the small careful chair of the PTA, a small careful late Victorian woman of 63, mother of a son at Cambridge and a daughter at the Slade, had let it be known, at her small careful private PTA tea meeting in the small careful 3rd week of October, that Miss Beatrice Holland was the kind of small careful village music mistress who would do well enough for the children's hymn singing and the small careful school harvest concert, but who could not be expected to take any small careful private musical lead at the small careful autumn concert that mattered. Mrs. Lambourn had asked, at the same small careful private PTA tea meeting, whether her own daughter, the small careful Slade student, who had taken her small careful first piano examination at the small careful Royal College 15 years before she had taken up the small careful private modern oil painting, might be permitted instead to give the small careful solo item at the autumn concert. The small careful PTA had voted, by 7-2, that Mrs. Lambourn's daughter should give the small careful solo item. I had heard the small careful matter, at the small careful private vestry meeting on the Friday afterwards, from the small careful headmistress Miss Edith Carthy. I had told Miss Carthy that the small careful governor's board would, with the small careful private courtesy of the school, ask Miss Holland to play a small careful short piece at the small careful end of the concert, as the small careful school's music mistress, regardless of the small careful PTA's vote. I had also asked Miss Carthy whether Mr. Theodore Burnham, who had not attended the small careful autumn concert in the 18 months since his small careful private bereavement, might be persuaded, as the small careful parish organist of 42 years, to attend in the small careful private capacity of guest of honor. Miss Carthy said she would ask him. Mr. Burnham agreed to attend. The small careful autumn concert of the second Tuesday in November was held in the small careful school hall at 7:30. The hall held, on the small careful folding chairs, perhaps 140 parents. The small careful chairs of the small careful front row were reserved for the small careful school governors, the headmistress, and the small careful guest of honor Mr. Theodore Burnham, in his small careful black widower's morning coat, with the small careful white silk evening scarf his wife had given him at his 60th birthday round his neck, at the small careful aisle seat of the front row. The small careful concert proceeded. The small careful infants sang their small careful harvest songs. The small careful juniors recited their small careful poems. The small careful Slade student Miss Lavinia Lambourn, 28, in a small careful smart Bond Street evening gown her mother had bought her for the small careful occasion, sat at the small careful school's old Broadwood upright at 8:15 and played, with small careful nervous fingers and a small careful private fluff at the 8th bar, a small careful Chopin mazurka in B-flat major. The small careful audience applauded politely. Mrs. Hester Lambourn, at the small careful front row 2 seats from Mr. Burnham, clapped at her small careful daughter's small careful Chopin for an unusual small careful private length of time. The small careful end of the concert came at 9:15. The small careful headmistress Miss Carthy stood up at the small careful school's headmistress's lectern. She announced, in the small careful private courtesy I had asked her to extend, that the small careful school music mistress Miss Beatrice Holland would give the small careful closing item of the small careful evening at the small careful Broadwood. The small careful audience, by the small careful private direction of the PTA, gave a small careful private polite half applause. Miss Beatrice Holland walked, in her plain ankle-length dark grey village schoolmistress's dress, and her small careful village brown leather boots, from the small careful side door of the small careful school hall to the bench of the small careful school's old Broadwood upright. She sat at the bench. She set her hands very gently at the keys. She played from memory the second intermezzo of the Brahms Klavierstücke Opus 118, the small careful intermezzo in a major andante tenorament, the small careful late intimate piano piece of Brahms's small careful 60th year, perhaps the most quietly beloved of all the small careful late piano pieces of the entire Brahms literature. She played it by the small careful private clock of my pocket watch at the small careful front row, in 5 minutes and 48 seconds. She played it by my own small careful private witness from the front row, as if it were the small careful private cradle song of the small careful village of Lavering in Suffolk. It is the small careful private piece that the late Mrs. Caroline Burnham, Mr. Theodore Burnham's late wife, had played as her small careful private encore at her small careful private last Wigmore recital in the spring of her 65th year, and the small careful private piece every working pianist of the country had known, for the small careful long 40 years of Mrs. Burnham's small careful private concert career, was the small careful unmistakable Caroline Burnham piece. Miss Holland's small careful private playing of the Brahms, Opus 118 No. 2 was by my own small careful private witness from the front row, the small careful unmistakable Caroline Burnham playing of the small careful piece, the small careful particular slow inward tempo of the small careful opening cantabile, the small careful particular voicing of the small careful inner voice counterpoint of the middle section, the small careful particular tender held quality of the small careful final, return to the small careful tonic a major. Mr. Theodore Burnham, at the small careful aisle seat of the front row, sat very still in his small careful black widower's morning coat. He held the small careful white silk evening scarf his wife had given him at his 60th birthday very still at his small careful private chest. By the small careful andante tenorament of the middle section, He had set down the small careful white silk scarf at his small careful knees, and had pressed both his small careful hands, palms together, very quietly against his small careful private mouth. By the small careful final return to the small careful tonic, a major he had closed his small careful private eyes, and was weeping, very quietly, in the small careful private way of a small careful private widower of the parish at the small careful Tuesday autumn concert he had not attended in the 18 months since his bereavement. Miss Beatrice Holland lifted her hands from the small careful final tonic a major chord. She set them in her lap. She sat very still at the bench of the small careful Broadwood. The school hall was completely silent. Mr. Theodore Burnham, the small careful parish organist of 42 years, the widower of the late concert pianist Mrs. Caroline Burnham, the guest of honor at the small careful aisle seat of the front row, stood up at the small careful aisle seat. He walked in his small careful black widower's morning coat, the small careful length of the small careful aisle of the school hall to the small careful corner of the Broadwood upright. He stopped at the small careful corner of the Broadwood. He took, in his small careful private right hand, the small careful right hand of Miss Beatrice Holland at the bench. He turned in the small careful aisle to the small careful school hall. He said in the small careful private parish organist's voice he had used at St. Mary's for 42 years, "Ladies and gentlemen of St. Mary's Parish, I shall with respect ask the small careful chair of the governors, the Reverend Mr. Cuthbert Allerby, to forgive me the small careful private interruption of the small careful school's autumn concert. I shall ask the small careful headmistress Miss Edith Carthy to forgive me the small careful private interruption of the small careful school's autumn concert. I shall ask Mrs. Hester Lambourn, the small careful chair of the PTA, to forgive me the small careful private interruption of the small careful school's autumn concert. I shall not with respect sit silent at the small careful front row of the small careful aisle in the small careful private capacity of guest of honor, while the small careful school of which I have been the small careful parish organist for 42 years, thanks Miss Beatrice Holland with a small careful private polite half applause." He paused. He said, "Ladies and gentlemen, Miss Beatrice Holland is, by her own small careful private quiet decision of the small careful summer, the small careful single living pupil my late wife Mrs. Caroline Burnham took in the small careful private last 7 years of her small careful retirement in the small careful village of Lavering in Suffolk. My late wife did not, in those small careful 7 years, tell me who the small careful pupil was. I have, in the 18 months since my small careful private bereavement, not known. I have, in the small careful private 5 minutes and 48 seconds since Miss Holland began the small careful intermezzo at the small careful Broadwood, known. The small careful playing is, by the small careful unmistakable private witness of any small careful gentleman who heard my wife play the Opus 118 No. 2 at the Wigmore in the spring of her 65th year, the small careful unmistakable Caroline Burnham playing of the small careful piece. The small careful private handshape, the small careful private inward tempo of the opening cantabile, the small careful particular voicing of the middle section, the small careful tender held quality of the small careful final return to the small careful tonic. These are my late wife's small careful private playing. They are the small careful playing she gave in her small careful private last 7 years to the small careful village girl she chose to be the small careful single living heir of her playing." He turned to Miss Holland. He said in a voice almost too quiet for the small careful front row to hear, "Miss Holland, I shall claim you, here in the small careful school hall of St. Mary's Parish Primary, in the small careful presence of the parish, as my late wife's small careful living pupil, the small careful single living musician of her 7 small careful Lavering years, the small careful private heir of her playing. I shall with respect ask the parish to receive you accordingly." The small careful school hall held the small careful silence for a count, by the small careful private clock of my pocket watch, of about 9 seconds. Then the small careful school hall rose. The whole hall rose at the small careful folding chairs. The small careful applause that followed lasted, by the small careful private clock of my pocket watch, 4 minutes and 20 seconds. Mrs. Hester Lambourn, at the small careful front row 2 seats from Mr. Burnham, stood up at her small careful folding chair. She walked in her small careful private Wednesday afternoon hat, the small careful length of the small careful aisle to the small careful corner of the Broadwood. She took in her own small, careful, private right hand Miss Holland's small, careful, private left hand. She said in her small, careful, private PTA chair's voice, "Miss Holland, I have been a small, careful, private ass. I beg your pardon, I beg the parish's pardon, I beg the small, careful, late Mrs. Caroline Burnham's pardon. I shall with respect propose at the next small, careful PTA meeting that Miss Holland's small, careful, private salary at the small, careful school's music post be raised, by the small, careful, private agreement of the PTA, to the small, careful, private rate the parish would have given her late teacher had she taken our small, careful, private music post in her own small, careful retirement. I will skip the next 4 years. Miss Holland was confirmed in her music post at the next vestry meeting. She has, in the 4 years since, taught the pianoforte at the Broadwood to perhaps 70 Holloway children. She has also taken on 3 Saturday pupils of her own at the organ loft of St. Mary's, at Mr. Burnham's invitation. Mr. Theodore Burnham resumed his attendance at the autumn concert each November. He gives, at each concert, the opening welcome in his late wife's name. He gave Miss Holland the late Mrs. Burnham's library of pianoforte scores the spring after the school concert. Mrs. Hester Lambourn kept her word. The PTA raised Miss Holland's salary the following Wednesday. Mrs. Lambourn herself took up the pianoforte for the first time since her Royal College examination of 40 years before. She takes a weekly lesson at the Broadwood at 4:30 each Thursday. She is, by her own admission, learning slowly. I have in the small, careful drawer of my retirement parlor desk the small, careful, private printed program of the autumn concert of the second Tuesday in November. I look at it on the long, quiet evenings now. I think about Mr. Theodore Burnham standing up at the small, careful aisle seat of the front row and walking the small, careful length of the small, careful aisle to the small, careful corner of the small, careful Broadwood. I think about the small, careful 5 minutes and 48 seconds of the small, careful Brahms Intermezzo in a major. I think about a small, careful village girl from the small, careful village of Lavering, Suffolk, who was the small, careful single living pupil of a famous concert pianist in the small, careful private last 7 years of her life, and who took her small, careful diploma at Ipswich, and her small, careful first post at a small, careful Holloway Parish Primary School, and who did not, by her own small, careful, private, quiet decision of the small, careful summer, mention to her small, careful head mistress that she was the small, careful, single living musician of those small, careful 7 years. The Brahms Opus 118 No. 2 does that to small, careful widower of the parish on a wet Tuesday evening of the second Tuesday in November. If the small, careful new school music mistress at the small, careful Broadwood, in the small, careful corner of the school hall, has been quietly taught the small, careful Caroline Burnham playing of the small, careful piece in the small, careful village of Lavering, Suffolk, in the small, careful last 7 years of his late wife's small, careful private retirement. And the parish, on the small, careful private witness of a small, careful widower, at the small, careful corner of a small, careful Broadwood upright at 9:15, claims her.